Welcome to The Details with Adam Frewer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world today. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So, Cecil, welcome. Today, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the January 6th investigation, which I'm sure is going to be a hot topic for many people.
Very much so. I think wherever you fall on the spectrum of things, a very stimulating topic.
So we should probably give a little bit of background about why we're going to talk about this, but also how we're going to talk about this, because I think we're going to try to talk about this in a slightly different way than a lot of the news is going to cover it and a lot of the political commentary is going to be. And so I'll just start with, for those of you who are outside of the United States, or for those of you who are not following this particular political event, I'll just give you a little bit of background of what is happening. So on January 6th of 2020,
Yeah, that's correct.
I had to check the year for a second. Yeah, January 6th of 2020. It seems like so much time has passed.
It simultaneously feels 10 years ago and like this year.
Yeah. There were big protests, big riots that happened at the United States Capitol. And on that day, Congress was meeting to ratify the election results. And what happens, again, for those of you who are unfamiliar, each of the representatives for the particular states, they pledge their particular votes and they say, our votes go to such and such a candidate. And we verify that those have been done in our state accurately. And then the vice president at the time ratifies the election as a whole and says it was done fairly and accurately. So that process was happening inside of the United States Capitol building. And outside of the Capitol, there were riots and protests, and then people broke police barricades. They broke into the Capitol. And since that time, many people who were part of those protests, part of that riot, they have been charged with various crimes. Many of them have been convicted of those crimes. Some are serving sentences in prison. Some are on probation or have fines or those kinds of things. So there's a spectrum. The investigation then was put in place by members of Congress, and they were going to investigate, in essence, what role Donald Trump played, if any, into the instigation of these riots. And originally, this committee started as fact-finding mission, and they were just going to say, what role did he play? How much did he instigate this process? And then now we are starting to hear the results of their investigation. They're presenting the findings of what their committee has discovered. Anything that you want to add as far as that?
No, that was a beautiful description, actually. It took almost a year and a half of political ups and downs and distilled it into one quick synopsis.
we only have a short amount of time here.
It's very true.
So then we need to get into, so why are we considering this, right, on this podcast? And the first thing I want to say is because for those of us in the United States, this is all-encompassing experience that for several years, this has been an ongoing conversation, and this is kind of a culminating moment. So that's one reason. But another reason that we're considering it is because of this committee. And the committee was originally charged with finding truth. Where is the truth in all of this? What evidence is there of what role Donald Trump played, what role he didn't play? And we want to kind of think about this concept of discovering truth. We want to also be thinking about this idea as it relates to therapy in people will come with various versions of truth, potentially. But what we really want to focus on is this idea of how we look at things within a given context, how much we believe people who come into therapy. Do you want to say anything more about kind of how we're going to be looking at it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it seems like it's a common stance to take to investigate the accuracy of the statements and perspectives of the things that clients will say in therapy. And I know for a lot of clinicians and maybe even modalities in general, that feels really, really relevant. But just like you said about the investigation that this committee did to January 6th, I think similar to us, I would say that I don't really think the accuracy of a story that someone might spin is relevant. The real goal is, like you said earlier, they had something much more concrete to get to, and that's how responsible was Donald Trump and other actors in what unraveled on that day, and essentially where do we go from there. And I think that's very much what people are coming into therapy for, right? Not the Scooby-Doo chase of where did your problems come from. And maybe that's interesting to some people, and maybe that is what some people are looking for. But what actually is really impactful is where do you go from here now?
Yeah, I think that's such a valuable thing, right? So this committee, they weren't saying, did the riots happen? Yes or no. Did they break into the Capitol? Yes or no. In essence, they're saying this horrible thing happened. Right. Our Constitution was kind of hanging in the balance of, will they overturn this election or will they not? Will they murder the people who are trying to verify the election? Yes or no, right? They're not calling any of that into question. Right. The foundation of the whole thing is this happened and it was bad. It was bad that it happened. So what this committee now is trying to find, or what they're trying to do, is what role did certain people play in this investigation? In some sense, where are they complicit with creating this? Where are they potentially not? And now they're just saying, this is the evidence of what we've found. And I think when we think about that in our lives, we don't have to question, people come into therapy, we don't have to question, are they telling me the truth? Did really horrible things happen? Yes or no? Are they really struggling? Yes or no? Are they in denial? Yes or no? That is outside of our purview in some sense. Our job is to say, we take at face value that things happened, that what your experience of those things, that's truth. So what we're trying to do then in the moment is say, so given that all of those things have happened, how do we proceed forward? What's the best course of action going forward, right? And as we link it back, perhaps they'll find that Donald Trump was complicit a lot. And perhaps they'll say, now there needs to be criminal charges placed, right? So that would be one course of action in the future. Or perhaps they'll say, maybe he wasn't complicit at all. And here's the evidence that we found that he isn't complicit at all. And that would require a very different course of action moving forward. And so I think really what this committee is setting up is, how do we move forward from here? And I think oftentimes that's the perspective that we take in therapy is, where are we going forward? What makes sense given the context of where you are right now?
I could see some clinicians listening to this and they might wonder, well, what if they're lying to us? What if the things that they say aren't true? They're not giving us the whole story about what has occurred, what has happened, or who they are, or things like that. How is what you're saying still relevant to those situations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think one of the things that we say is, their reality is their reality, right? So that opens the door to a couple of things. One, maybe they're lying to protect themselves, right? And that's a completely acceptable place to be. How do they know they should trust me? How do they know they should give me the accurate information? Because oftentimes when people come to therapy or they go interact with various systems, the legal system or a punitive system or those kinds of things, they get treated really horribly. And so they might be coming to me in a really self-protective stance. And I hold the belief that that's okay, that they get to be protective of themselves. They are smart even to be protective of themselves. So whatever reality they decide to give me, that's the reality that they have deemed is acceptable enough. So I just work with that acceptable enough and believe that if they need to, they'll change their answers according to what's really going on for them, or they'll warp whatever my questions are to be questions that make more sense given where they are. So I can trust that they're going to engage with the information in the best way possible. So they might be lying and they might know that they're lying, and that's okay with me. The other perspective is maybe they're telling me something that isn't true or that somebody else would have a different perspective about it, but they completely believe that that is the reality, right? So maybe they are not as connected with what actually happened as somebody else might say. And again, what I would say is that's okay. I would say that they then are behaving, the answers that they give are going to be based on their own reality. So it's going to be relevant, it's going to be pertinent, it's going to be meaningful to them because it's consistent with what they believe and what they think and how they're perceiving something. Yeah. So whether they're being dishonest in air quotes, right, because they're choosing to, or because they are unaware, either way, the conversation that we build about how we move forward can still be relevant to them.
Yeah, and I think that draws another pretty strong connection to what's going on with these hearings. The goal with these hearings was to have a very practical investigation, as you described, into how culpable were these people in this awful thing that happened. That actually resulted in deaths too, right? I think that provides a baseline of how terrible the event was, that lives were lost and harm was physically caused to people. But they didn't walk into this investigation with an assumption of guilty or not guilty. The assumption, though, like you're describing, was that everyone involved, there's a reasonable narrative to each of these people, whether they had motives, they had reasonings and understandings that guided them into what they're doing, whether that was something culpable or otherwise. And that's the assumption that we walk into, is who's to say this person is telling the truth or not telling the truth? Who knows what narrative that they're spinning and where that's coming from. But you're saying that there's a resting trust in what they're doing, what they need to do. They're being totally reasonable in not trusting me maybe with the whole truth. Or their mind has done what it needs to do to react to something traumatic or really negative that they've experienced, to where they don't even have access to the truth themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the things as you were talking that came to my mind is, right, this committee now has a certain perspective, right? They've interviewed a bunch of people, they've looked at a bunch of videos, they have developed a certain perspective. And if you talk to other people who aren't as close to all of that evidence, they're going to have a different perspective, right? We as onlookers might have a certain perspective. If that's going to be influenced by our own political beliefs, that's going to be influenced by our own upbringing, that's going to be influenced by our own social context, right? In addition, different members of Congress who are not part of this committee, they're going to have different perspectives. And I think one of the things that we're going to start hearing now is reactions, right? Reactions to this committee. And I think one of the things that's really valuable to think about is the same thing will happen in our clients' lives, that they'll be close to the experience, they'll have the evidence, they'll have the experience, but people around them will have different perspectives of their experience. And maybe they'll disagree with them, or maybe they'll criticize them, or they'll say that they're lying or whatever, right? But what we have to hold on to is we're hearing the experience of the person who's closest to the experience. And so when we choose who to believe or what to believe, it makes sense for us to believe the person closest to the experience. I think that's relevant here because we'll start now probably hearing contradictory views, which I think we could, if oftentimes like we do couples therapy or family therapy or group therapy, you might start to hear contradictory views, but it makes sense for us to kind of get to, but what is your hope for how to move forward despite these differing perspectives? How do you want to move forward?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what that surfaces is what you kind of mentioned earlier on, is being within your appropriate scope of what your job is. Like these hearings, the Investa Committee was put together to, as we said before, find how responsible these individuals were for what happened, but their job wasn't to prosecute anyone. Their job wasn't to defend anyone. And I think sometimes we can make mistakes in therapy if we put on the wrong hat or believe that we're holding a hat that we don't actually have. And so our job isn't to prosecute anyone, or our job isn't to form some case for what we need to defend or something along those lines. It's exactly what you've been describing before, is getting to a place of where is it that we're going to go from where we are now? And there's not much outside of that we really need to force onto the client, or there's not much we need to investigate, ironically, into what what has happened to them, who they are, what they've done, and things like that. It's a difficulty that some therapists have, is knowing what are the roles we're actually playing here.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. And I think if we even expand that to everyday people, right? Because I know that there's lots of people who will listen to this podcast who aren't clinicians.
Yeah.
And I think that we interact with each other in a similar way, right? We had experiences with one another, and we could choose to go back and we could say, like, hash it out and pull it apart, right? I have children, and oftentimes when they get into a disagreement, what ends up happening is they want to go in and like retell every detail and be like, he did such and such, and she, no, she did, da, 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 right? And oftentimes the way to resolve a dispute isn't to go back and rehash, because we'll never agree on what actually happened, because I experienced it from my perspective and you experienced it from your perspective. But the way then to resolve conflict is to say, how do we want to treat each other moving forward? What are you hoping to receive from your brother? Or how would you like your sister to engage with you? And so I think oftentimes with things like disagreement or conflict or whatever, the temptation is to go back. And I think the reality, just like this committee and just like we're talking about here, is really, how do we want, given what has happened, how do we want to move forward? What's the right course of action moving forward? And like with those disagreements, oftentimes the way forward has nothing to do with what has happened. It is, I want to be treated with respect, and I want them to speak kindly to me. And when we engage in that behavior, we can move forward and be happy with one another.
Right. I'm totally on your side with your parenting now, but I'll admit I hated that as a kid, because I was just minding my own business, and we need to get to the bottom of it so that you can see I'm the right one.
Yep.
But I think obviously that comes from a place of, that there's something less constructive there. That's the aim. It's retribution, or it's payback or something like that, rather than actually, probably from a parent's perspective, is ending the fighting. This is probably what you want.
Yes, that's peace. Really what I want.
So getting beyond that probably is the greater, more substantial goal to be had. But I could see how in the moment, probably much like with any political conflict too, it's we want payment. We want this person to feel the brunt of something as a result of what's happened.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I think, just to wrap up, I think one of the things that I would say is, we have this major political event happening, and they're presenting in some sense what has happened. But I think really what we can all draw from this experience is, okay, given what has happened, how do we want to move forward? And I think that there's ramifications for us politically, but there's also ramifications for us just as people, as we engage with people who have a different political perspective that might take something different from this political event, right? I think we can choose to interact with people from a place of, but how do we want to move forward?
Yeah.
And so I think that's oftentimes in the past, as we've done this podcast, we've left people with like a task of like, now go do this thing. And so I think that's one of the things that I would say is, as you engage with people who come from various political perspectives about this experience and about this investigation and what this means, keep in mind, how do I want to engage going forward? How do I want to move forward in a constructive, helpful, useful way?
Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.